Employers hiring managers, HR people of Reddit. Has anyone ever given you a reference that ended up costing them the job? If so, what happened? I used to work in a nursing home. We briefly employed a young girl, about 18 years old, who was useless. She would wander around the place with no shoes on. She would shower one resident in the time it took other carers to shower 5. When an old lady fell over in front of her. Happens all the time. Old ladies are not known for their ability to remain upright. She actually ran away screaming with her hands in the air, leaving the old lady on the floor. Then she went and had an extended cigarette break to calm her nerves. She did not pass her probation. For some reason, another staff member, who had the same position as this girl, was not her supervisor in any way, gave this girl a glowing reference that got her a job at a different nursing home. She did about as well there as she did with us. Not long after, the lady who gave the reference applied at the other home. They actually laughed at her and told her there was no way they were giving her a job after she sent them that girl. I was the reference that cost someone a job. This dumbass was my roommate's boyfriend. I hired him on at my shop because he needed some extra cash. He barely worked for the 2 months he worked for me. Like most of our lazy employees, we just phased him out rather than fire him. Anyway, he applied for a job in his field at a petroleum engineering company or something. It was a management position and he needed management experience. He put himself down as my supervisor. Well, they called me because they wanted to know what it was like being managed by him. I thought it was a mix-up and they said no. He put himself down as the manager of the shop. Yeah, no. I told them that was a straight up lie. He didn't get the job. Ballsy little crap he was. Not me, but a friend was called as a reference. He simply said legally, I can only say that he did work here, and that we would never hire him back. Next day, the guy that used him as a reference called, begging him to recant. I've used that line. I can tell you he worked here from X to Y, and that he is not a candidate for rehire. Usually the responses are, got it. I had an employee that I fired use me as a reference. The HR group that called asked about specific things on his resume. He put down stuff that even I, as his boss, didn't do. He apparently managed an $8 million department. I manage a $2 million department. He managed 0 of that. He was responsible for 8 employees. I had 6 at the time, including him. He had 0 reports. He was in charge of safety for our 500-person plant. We have a team of 4 full-time safety employees. I am not one. I told them why I fired him. He was a chemist. Verified his degree in chemistry. He mixed ammonia and bleach to clean his workstation. He did not get the job. I called this girl's reference and left a message. The lady called me back immediately, asking I wanted a what for who. Now, when I finally explained it to her, she tells me that the girl had worked for her as the only other employee in her doggy daycare, then stopped showing up to work, stole a bunch of money and supplies, and tried to report the lady to her licensing board for God knows what, which was dismissed. She couldn't believe the girl actually listed her as a reference. Guess she was gambling that I wouldn't call. I sometimes have to call the applicant and ask for someone else besides their parents. This is still a difficult thing for me even though I am 24 since my dad was my boss for a couple years. He was harder on me than anyone else, so a recommendation would actually be good from him. Not that anyone would see past him being my dad. My stepfather however gives me a glowing reference even though I have only worked for him a handful of times. HR person here. In a past job, I did a lot checking references. Called a reference for someone who was starting in a week or so. First employer is small company. Person who answers the phone tells me they want me to talk to the owner when I say the former employee's name. Owner comes on and is super friendly. I tell her the former employee and that I just need a quick reference. She tells me, I wish good things for all the people who've ever worked for me. I do not wish good things for her. Of course I ask why, and she tells me a whole list of issues, including her walking out in the middle of conversations to go smoke, never showing up to work on time, and on the days she did show up on time, she would ask to leave early. She goes on for about 5 minutes on all the reasons she was fired from the job. At some point, it's too much and I stopped taking notes. At this point in my career, I've never gotten more than a generic, yes they worked here for $X hour and that's all I can say. So I ask my manager how to handle this. She tells me try calling 2 more of the references and see what they say. Call a lawyer's office, who had hired her a temp contract employee for 3 months. They told me they asked her to leave 1/2 months in because the head lawyer said he couldn't deal with her anymore. She couldn't even finish out the contract. Same basic issues as the first reference. Call the final one. It was a franchise of a chain and the franchise had closed, so dead end. Call corporate and they can't verify because it was a franchised location. My manager calls the candidate and tells her that she needs to give us something else to go off the reference since we've gotten not so good ones so far. She cannot give us anything and the ones we had were awful, so we decide not to hire. I've been involved in the hiring of hundreds of employees and this was the only time I've ever had someone give an honest reference, and I was so glad we sidestepped that minefield. Yes, the reference said the applicant was likely involved in projects that during the interview he took full credit for. Dodge a bullet there. Always check references. You misunderstood. My greatest weakness is being humble. I had the opportunity to, but I declined. I was worried the guy was going to sue me. He was extremely paranoid when he worked for me. I coached him into doing his job better, but he quit unexpectedly. He left a 13-page Unabomber-style manifesto with both HR and my boss about how terrible I was and how I was an arrogant, narcissistic butthole, and how he was the only person on my team who did any work. 6 months later, I got a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail since I was busy. Same number called 7 more times that hour before I finally picked it up to find out what was so freaking urgent. Turned out it was manifesto guy asking for a reference. Not touching that one. Told him to contact HR. Whoa, some people are really clueless. It didn't cost him the job, though he still did not get it, but it was kind of a weird story. It happened this past summer. I was hiring for a warehouse worker position and was responsible for checking references. We had this one guy, had a 3-year gap in employment. Normally this isn't really a big deal as long as you have a good excuse. School, sick, taking care of someone is usually valid ones. He said he took a sabbatical to deal with the untimely death of his parents. So we called one reference. It was his former boss at a gas station he worked at in Utah. Guy answers the phone and tells me that he has been missing for 3 years after he and his parents got into a car crash and the parents died. According to the police, he left the scene, was not driving from what they could tell, and walked into the forest. So I call the guy back in, having notified the police who were sending people down to talk to him. I talked to him for a good while about the incident. He went into shock and left. By the time he realized what had really happened, he was on the run for like a week and didn't think he should go back. Dude spent 3 years living off stolen food, money, under the table jobs, and living in a tent and cars. Finally moved out here thinking he could apply for a job without anyone asking questions. He used an old resume he had on Google Drive and didn't realize it had the reference. He went back, I think served some time for running away, but was forgiven, and last I checked up on him on FB. I stalk from time to time. He's back in Utah working at a landscaping company. Not quite what you are asking for, but my ex-co-worker asked me to be a reference. I said it probably wasn't the best idea because I wouldn't lie for her. She used me anyways, so when the new potential employer called me I told them that she was late a lot, sick a lot, didn't contribute a lot, and had a personality that made people want to hit her. I'm pretty sure she didn't get that job. I thought I was going to be the reference that cost someone a job. I used to work at a fast food place that almost nobody ever got fired from, but there was one manager who got fired for drinking on the job, looking at pee in the office instead of making food, and basically being a colossal screw up. A few weeks later I got a call from a retail store asking about him. He put us down as a reference after all that. I couldn't disguise my shock and said he put this job on his work history. Then I said he was not eligible for rehire, but I couldn't give any details. They hired him anyway. I heard from someone who worked there that he stole a bunch of crap from them and they fired him within 6 weeks. I didn't feel too bad for them. They should have known better when even the stoner-staffed fast food joint wouldn't give a good reference. Not me, but the best story I have heard. I was working at a law firm and I found out that my boss's boss, financial officer, had applied for the job above him, operating officer, at the firm. He was the only candidate and was in the final references review and gave out someone's name. During the reference call, the guy actually convinced the firm that he was better for the job than the candidate and ended up getting the operation officer job over him and then hired him as his subordinate. Financial officer. I can't believe the guy actually took the job after that. He got Robert California'd. Company policy at the time was to contact both references. His first reference pulled the old Dilbert on me. I can't speak about this employee directly, but asked me about something else. Basically told me that people generally get fired from this position because they are rude, late, lazy or a combination of all three. His second reference didn't even know he was going to be a reference. In fact, the guy hasn't shown up to work for the past 5 weeks. I had it happen twice for the same role. We had a guy we thought was perfect, but in 2 separate references from 2 different companies we were told he was aggressive and argumentative, wouldn't get along with others, and when asked if they'd work with him again both said no. What was the worst was speaking to the next best candidate and being told he was about to be fired for poor performance without any reason, in a job less difficult than the one he was applying for. Nopers. I've had some former managers reach out to me and shed some light on some things, but I've never had someone say, here, call these people and have them trash the person. That being said, nowadays, most companies won't give recommendations. They are too risk adverse. The firms I've worked at, if you call for a recommendation, all they can do is give you an employment verification hotline number that you can call and it will tell you when the person worked there. Does a tenant count here? Don't just blindly put your past landlord apartment complex's number on your lease application. I own a couple rental properties and holy crap, landlords are eager and willing to tell you story after story about how horrible their tenants were. I called someone who was surprised he was put down as a reference for the candidate. This man was elderly and took his sweet time explaining everything the candidate did or didn't do in great detail. For example, she barely came to work and was never reachable by anyone. And, to top it off, she decided to not come to work one day and never came back. I still don't understand why she even put that man as her reference. I didn't get a job because of one of those references. Still not entirely sure why to this day 20 years later. The interviewer said she had called to check my reference and was informed that I was not eligible for rehire, and could I tell her why. I was stunned, speechless, and nearly started crying right there. These people I worked for previously were like family to me, and I gave them 3 months notice before I relocated to another state. There were gifts and tears and hugs when I left. I felt so betrayed by them that I never bothered to ask why. Our application process requires 3 references. I once had an applicant put her sister, a friend from her Bible study, and a previous employee, who quit after 3 days, as her references. The sister did not know she was a reference and said they got along well but had never worked together. The Bible study friend did not know she was a reference and said the applicant was usually on time for Bible study and had a really nice heart. I didn't bother calling the previous employee. It was already a no from me. Dog. Working as a recruiter, I've had some great ones. Reference said to me, "Are you serious?" She gave my name, then proceeded to say she was the worst consultant she ever had. Then followed up via email with the testimony of someone else in her team on how awful this person was. We had a guy put my colleague on an application for a government job saying that he was his boss at X department. He most certainly was not. I had a guy with overseas references, so I sent each of them our template to fill out since we only had a few hours per day to connect during business hours. Each reference comes back virtually identical. I call up Buddy and read it back to him and he insists it's a coincidence. Same spelling mistakes, and in most cases the same word for word remarks. This comes up more often and in more ways than you think. People are not intelligent. Holy crap. You really have to be dedicated to not only give a terrible reference, but to actively seek out testimony from a second source and provide that as well. I was on the receiving end of one of these. A young woman submitted her resume for an assistant position and her qualifications were impressive. She listed herself as executive assistant to the CEO of a well-known company in my industry. So I called my friend who worked for a VP at the same company. I wanted to know why she was leaving, since the job at my company was not at all as good as the job she was currently in. After a brief pause, I learned that the applicant had been a receptionist, not an assistant, and she had been sleeping with the CEO. Once the CEO tried to end their situation, the applicant threatened blackmail. She was fired immediately after that. I sent her resume back to HR and that girl was blackballed from my company and the placement agency that submitted her. I once gave an honest reference for a former co-worker who'd applied at my previous place of employment. The guy was dumb as a sack of doorknobs. Ruined another co-worker's left-hand drill bit set. I couldn't figure out why it was drilling so slow, so I just went faster, and I once walked in on him draining fuel from an airplane, not an uncommon task, by himself, from 4 or 5 points simultaneously, into ungrounded plastic pails, several of which were overflowing and spilling all over the floor and running into the floor drain. Serious explosion hazard. The other place hired him anyway. Called me again a couple months later to let me know he was working out really well. Guess the guy just needed more supervision. Not HR, but was a director owner of a games development studio. Anyway, got a CV once that listed all the games this guy had written. Oddly though, one of the games was one that another of the company directors had written. HR would not let me bring him in for interview and grill him. Dang, that would have been gold. Not a HR person, but a reference has cost me getting a job once, almost cost me a second time. I'm a teacher in the UK and 3 or 4 years into my career, I had applied for a promotion to head of department in a different school. My current school tried to convince me to stay, but they couldn't offer me the promotion, so I went for it. I thought I aced the interview and got down to the final 2, but I was passed over for someone else. The deputy head at the potential new school told me that he would have usually given his right leg for a teacher like me, but that I should get my current head to write me a better reference next time. I chalked it up to experience, but less than 12 months later, the same position in my current school opened up and I was given that job. As part of the handover of paperwork from the current head of department, I found the reference I had been given. It was shocking. It literally said that I couldn't do the job. I couldn't do the job that they had just given me. I did that job, I thought, very well, for the next 6 or 7 years, but things changed and so I applied for a sideways move to a different school. Again, my current school wanted me to stay and tried to tempt with all sorts, but I stood firm and went for interview. This time, the head at the new school, who I will always thank for this, brought up my reference in interview and said that he was confused because my reference was so poor, but what he'd seen had been much better. Literally everything that was in there I was able to put the other side to. I got the job. My old head was obviously writing bad references for those teachers he wanted to keep. I hear he also wrote glowing references for those he wanted rid of as well. You have been visited by the distinguished doggo of delicious delicacies. Comment tasty supper, pupper, and be blessed with delectable dishes for the next decade. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.